And the moral of this story is to avoid the website eBay. Seriously, avoid that website at all costs, because it will do nothing but wreak havoc on your finances. And the worst thing to do is not only go on eBay, but go on eBay at 2 a.m. in the morning, because you will find some little trinket that will do nothing but trigger that little impulse buying urge, and the next thing you know, going and living life without this certain item will become absolutely impossible. And that is exactly what happened with not just one, but two of these models that we have here. Oh well, might as well make the best of it. Let's go ahead and throw these two up together. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com. I'm here to welcome you today to a double feature video for these two 1/35th scale German Panzer IV ausf.Ds. These two models here are built for my own personal collection and are not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6th scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. If anyone is watching this video and you're getting a sense of deja vu, fear not, your brain is working properly, because this is not the first time that a Tamiya 1/35th scale Panzer IV ausf.D kit has come across his desk. I recently completed one a few videos ago, and these two here are built on the exact same kit. However, with the way that kit is designed, you have the option to build it in a multitude of configurations, and these two options over here are two of the other examples that the kit can be built into. In this video, I'm going to be going over what these differences are, as well as giving both of these kits a quick in-box review. Aside from that, I'm also going to be going over several other aspects of the builds to watch out for. So if you're into old retro kit builds, this is definitely going to be the video for you. So just sit back and enjoy, because there's going to be a bunch of info coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around these two models. And these two vehicles over here are the German Panzer ausf.D. The Panzer IV is an iconic and very successful medium tank design that was built by Germany during the World War II timeframe. Although this tank series is forever in the shadow of its more famous younger brothers, being the Tiger and the Panther, the Panzer IV was actually the most prolific German tank that was produced during that time frame, and was also the one that had all the bugs more or less ironed out. The vehicle also was pretty much the backbone of the German Armored Corps during World War II. Essentially what the Sherman was to the Allies, the Panzer IV was to the Wehrmacht. This vehicle was very, very adaptable and was able to be the basis for a large number of other military vehicles that served with the Wehrmacht. Anything from self-propelled howitzers to tank destroyers to even anti-aircraft equipment, all of these have some sort of vehicle based on the Panzer IV platform. The vehicle's design dates back to the mid to late 1930s, and at this time Germany was rearming and they were developing and producing a new generation of military equipment, and their tanks were definitely one of them. Their mainstay at the time was actually supposed to be the Panzer III, and the Panzer IV was intended to be used as an infantry support vehicle that housed a large, at the time, caliber 75mm main armament. This was for use for engaging fortifications and pillboxes, much along the lines as what the Americans did with the 105mm Sherman. Because of its intended role, the vehicle was given much thicker armor compared to the Panzer III counterpart. In 1936, the design was finalized and was given the approval. From there, it went on into full production and eventually being fielded with the Wehrmacht. As with most things that enter into production and eventually get fielded, some shortcomings of the design as well as areas of improvement are noticed, and these were addressed by the engineers and were taken care of in the subsequent versions that came built from the factory. By the time the ausf.D variant was in production, the armor protection was thickened, as well as also some changes were made to the armament itself, reintroducing the bow MG, amongst other things. The Panzer IV ausf.D was ready in 1938, just before the invasion of Poland, and the vehicle saw action during that campaign, along with the other campaigns that took place around the same time frame, which would also include the invasion of France. The vehicles performed adequately in both of those campaigns, and then when the campaign in North Africa started up, the Panzer IV ausf.D was one of the vehicles sent to that campaign and also saw service in that location. It was in North Africa where some other shortcomings of the design were noticed, namely with ventilation. With the way the vehicle was designed originally, the engine compartment had two large doors on the top deck, and they were just steel plates with no other sort of vents or grills or anything along those lines. Well, in the hot African desert, this became a bit of an issue and the engines began to overheat. And so one design that was quickly revised was with the design of a new engine hatch that had these grillwork sections that were fitted in place. This would alleviate the overheating problem, and this design would evolve as the vehicle continued in production to another type of engine grille that would stay with the Panzer IV all the way up until the end of its construction. Another upgrade that was made to the Panzer IV ausf.D to keep it relevant was with its armor protection. When the vehicle was first designed, it actually did get thicker armor compared to its predecessors. However, with the way technology evolves quite quickly, the armor protection was soon going to be realized to be inadequate. So, large sections of applicate armor were developed for the Panzer IV's hull, and these were bolted on place on several locations on the crew compartment for the ausf.D variant. With these upgrades, the tank chugged along for a little while. However, the real shortcoming that this vehicle did have was with its armament. The short-barreled 75 was great when the vehicle was first designed. However, by this point in the war, 1942, 1943 or so, that short-barrel 75 was definitely showing its limitations, specifically with the Allied tanks that were coming on the scene at the period, being the Russians with the T-34 and the Americans and the Western Allies with the Sherman. And the short barrel was definitely not going to be up to snuff to dealing with these threats, so eventually the Germans would go ahead and rearm their Panzer IVs with a 75 higher velocity armament. And with the way the tank was designed, this was advantageous because there was some good room in the turret to fit the new ordnance. However, with the combination of the new heavy ordnance as well as also with the new armor protection, the vehicle's mobility off-road was going to suffer because, again, it wasn't anticipated to have this sort of weight. To deal with this, the designers came up with a new pattern of track that was wider compared to the original pattern, and then this would be the new gauge of track that would be found on the Panzer IV family platform from here on out. These modifications would be added to several existing ausf.D vehicles, upgrading them and trying to keep them, again, in service as long as possible. However, as a factory-built item, these would be features found on vehicles that came after the ausf.D pattern. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when these two models were first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit as well as their conditions were in at the start of the project. And here are the models at the start of the build. For the base starter kits, I'll be utilizing two of these vintage Tamiya 1/35 scale Panzer IV ausf.D kits. If anyone is a fan of the channel, you'll know that this is not the first time one of these Panzer IV D kits has come across this desk. I recently completed, or at least the time this video drops, I completed another video of one of these models over here, and these two here are literally the exact same kit. The only difference is that these two models are manufactured many years after the manufacturing of the kit in that video, as that kit was an original late 1970s release, while these two over here are a more contemporary example. As for the kit's background, I go over this in more depth in the other video, but basically Tamiya released this kit in the late 1970s, about 1976 to 1978, around thereabouts. The kit itself is based upon the older Panzer IV ausf.H kit that was released by Tamiya in the late 1960s or in the early 1970s. That kit was originally designed to be motorized and was offered as such along with dual motor remote, and Tamiya basically took that chassis and ran with it and designed a bunch of kits based off of the Panzer IV platform. Many of these kits have been in constant production basically ever since, and this kit here is actually one of them. These kits here have been ridiculously easy to find since they were originally released back in the 70s. The only thing that's really changed on them are just some minor aspects of the box art, like for instance the paper stock, as well as also some verbiage that has been added to the sections of the box. And the other thing that changed that's most significant was where the unit was molded. The original kits were molded in Japan, while later on, towards the 80s into the 90s, Tamiya moved their manufacturing to the Philippines, and that's, I believe, where they still are located today. And the kits that were manufactured in the Philippines just had that little verbiage added to the molds themselves. Outside of that, the two kits are literally identical. So as for how these two kits wound up in the stash, well, first, they are a very new addition. I picked these up about 3 or 4 months ago, so they've been sitting in the stash for not that long of a period of time. This actually goes back to when I started the other Panzer IV. I really do like this kit, and while I was looking at the box, I saw that, you know, it had several options available in terms of markings and also other fittings that could be built. And I'm like, you know what, this seems like a cool model to snatch a number of them up, and, you know, it'll be neat to build one in each of the configurations. So I went ahead on eBay, as I do at 2 o'clock in the morning, which I really shouldn't, and I actually came across this example that we have here. This one here fit the bill perfectly. It was a bagged kit, as you can see. It's obviously used. The model itself is all in brand new condition. The only thing that is not present is the actual box, as the box was damaged at some point for one reason or another. So the contents were just put in the El Cheapo Ghetto Ziploc bag that we have here and sold as such. The models are very easily come by, but this one here, it was one of those Sarah McLachlan, you know, sad puppy commercial type things. I saw the kit and I decided, you know what, I think I could give this one justice, so let me go ahead and bring it under my wing and add it to my collection. I bought the model. I paid a little bit more than I should have, admittedly, but for what it's worth, it's still going to make for a good video, so screw it, why not? Then right after I bought this one over here, the recommended section being what it is, recommended this kit here from another vendor, which is actually a big one. I believe it's, what is it? Not Tower Hobbies, it's Tower Hobbies subsidiary, and I saw it and they had this one for an excellent price. It was a little over 20 bucks, give or take shipping, and I'm like, you know what, screw it, yeah, why not, it's just an extra 20 bucks, who cares, and I went ahead and ordered it, and the model promptly arrived. And these two have been sitting in the stash ever since. So since they are the exact same kit, I might as well go ahead and do the double feature route and do the two literally at the exact same time. So, starting with the El Cheapo bagged kit here, nothing really go over it with the graphic design and the box art, as, you know, obviously there is none, it's just Ziploc bag goodness. So let's go ahead and pour the contents out on the table to see exactly what is supplied in this model here. So, okay, I could already see something that is awry. The front hatch here for the transmission cover is busted, it looks like it's cracked. So that's great. Let's see if it's on the sprue. And by the way, the seller did sell this in an as-is condition, so basically was taking the risk on at the beginning of the project. But again, like I stated before, I felt bad for this kit, and if there's anyone out there on the internet, specifically on YouTube, that could take this and turn it around, it's definitely yours truly. I think I have a good track record of doing that at this point. So, all right, on this runner over here, I can see we got some damage going on. Several, or it looks like one or two of these little pegs here for the return rollers are busted. Not a problem for me. I could definitely tackle that and fix that, and we'll see how that pans out as the video goes on. Everything else seems to be okay. You know, it has all of the suspension pieces in place. They look like they're in great condition. All right, I am missing a wheel here, but I believe it's in this pile. By the way, this is the first time I've taken this tank out of the bag. It's literally been sitting here since the summertime. So, and I'm filming this currently in November, so who knows when this video actually makes its debut. This runner over here contains just some more components. The individual snipped the runners in half just so they could fit better in the box. But here we have a majority of the hull components, be the exhaust manifold, the rear tinwork sections, as well as the rear plate, and a few other odds and ends. Shovel here looks like it's a bit deformed, probably from the heat and from being in the bag. It looks like it's bent, but this looks like that it's something that could straighten very easily once I relieve the pressure by snipping the rear section off, and I could then torque the plastic back straight. Let's see what else we got here. All right, we have a sprue containing more ausf.D components. There's the hatch, the other portion over there, which this one cracked off on. Pretty sure I could fix that. If not, I'll just make a mold of a fresh one and just roll with that, but we'll see how that pans out as the video goes on. You can see the ausf.D pattern of rear engine hatches. Now, I'm on the fence if I'm going to go ahead and render this one in Panzer Gray or if I'm going to make it with DAK. We'll see how that continues, but regardless, you know, all the parts seem to be in good condition on this section. Alright, we have here the turret runner. It's basically all intact. I'm not seeing anything fishy going on over here. It is exactly as it needs to be. The two halves for the turret would be in this section over here, and I have them right here in my hand. Good condition, not broken or warped or anything like that. Should be more than suffice for the job at hand. I have here the 75mm right there. It's in good shape. We got here a chunk of sprue, not really relevant. Okay, this runner here is still bagged. This one here contains many other components, for instance, the DAK accessories and even the late pattern of idler wheel, or I should say the early pattern of idler wheel. That was a Freudian slip right there. And we got the details right there on the part. Again, this is still mint in bag, as I referenced in the other video. And here you can see the upper and lower hull sections. They are in perfect condition, nothing much going on here that's noteworthy. Yep, and they should build as good as any other Tamiya, be it fresh or pre-opened. I got here a hatch for the driver. Looks like it got ripped off the runner. Got some damage going on over here in the corner. That's going to be something I'm going to have to fix. We have here another return roller. Looks like a busted stem on this one again. Something that needs to be repaired. Here we got the other wheel that I was referring to before, and we also have some polycaps. We have another runner of polycaps, which is part and parcel for these old school Tamiya kits. And the best part about these Tamiya kits, single piece vinyl tracks, not like the new ones which they completely screwed up with giving you individual link and link, which was a horrible, horrible mistake, can't stand it. And yes, that is a hill I will die on because those tracks are indeed trash. And I do get lots of phone calls from people who call me up, complaining about that. Oddly enough, they complain to me. Like, I'm not Tamiya. Tamiya USA's phone number is that way. But yeah, those tracks are pretty bad. All right, so these tracks here are a product of the era that they were made in. These tracks date back to the mid and early 1970s. So the outer track thread is actually pretty good, specifically for the era that these were molded in. And the inner sections are decent. They're not perfect. Like, for instance, the hinge section is just stylized. There is no actual hinge detailing molded in like you would see on the Panzer IV kits that came out in the next generation from the 1990s time frame. But, for what these tracks are, they will do the job absolutely perfectly. It's also important to point out that these tracks are totally wrong for this vehicle. These vehicles over here would have, I believe, had thinner tracks, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that. But Tamiya did take a shortcut by just rinse, washing, and repeating basically all of the suspension parts that they had on hand from the existing tooling. We have that busted hatch, as I mentioned before. Something's going to have to be repaired. And we have the instructions, which are in perfect shape because they are paper instructions, no less. Here goes the decal sheet, blue paper backing. Again, the decal sheet is in phenomenal shape, and I'm not seeing any potential issues with using them here. So that's all there is to mention about that. Oh, and look at that. We have one of these stems for one of the broken return rollers. That's probably going to be recycled. So that's all there is for the bagged one. Let's go ahead and crack the other one open to see exactly how that kit fared out. And here we have the fresh kit. Like I mentioned before, this kit I believe is still in production, or if it's not anymore, it's been in production for a considerable long period of time. And because of that, like I said before, availability and costs are very, very reasonable for this one here. So the model's still sealed in its shrink wrap. Let's go ahead and cut this guy open. So as I mentioned in the other Panzer IV ausf.D video, this kit here has a very nice box art, typical Tamiya quality, white backing, very nice illustration right here on the forefront. It does have some details that are found on the box art over here that are not present on the actual kit. In typical Tamiya fashion, the vehicle on the illustration is better than the kit that you actually get. And here you get to see the little armored collars that are around the final drives. Yes, those are not included with the set. Regardless, the kit is still an excellent kit, regardless, despite what some smug modeling elitists may say. So the illustration is the same, all of the verbiage is the same. Where the difference lies is with some of the smaller verbiage that we have here. Like I stated before, since the thing has been in production for as long as it has been, the verbiage on the box has been upgraded to keep the kit relevant with modern times. Not so much tooling, like I said before, but definitely with the verbiage on the outside. And you would see things like on the side over here, we have some more of these little graphics. I believe those have to do with some kind of recycling type system that is in Japan. We have right here the updated Tamiya information, as well as also we have the copyright right here, 1977, when the kits were originally produced. And this one here is made in the Philippines. Like I stated before, these kits were originally produced in Japan, and then in the 80s, 90s time frame, they moved manufacturing locations. Also, one big difference between the two eras is that originally when these kits were brought into the United States, they were distributed by the company MRC. In the 1990s timeframe, Tamiya no longer utilized MRC for their distribution and hooked up their own distribution hub in the United States known as Tamiya USA, and that information is going to be found on this box. The other example that I brought to video a little while ago, that one was, again, due to the age that that kit was manufactured and brought into the United States, that is one of the MRC models. The other difference between the two is with the box itself. If we looked at the other video, the cardboard was a much thicker stock compared to this one here. And this is just a small thing. This is primarily relevant to people who just collect Tamiya models, but the kits from back then, the paper stock was much thicker, more robust compared to the type of paper stock that we have now. And this is much along the lines as we've seen on Tamiya kits from the last 25, 30 plus years. Of course, the box still has all of the kick-ass Tamiya information. We have the nice little end tabs over here, and we also have the really cool little sample shots of the other kits in the lineup. Unlike the other kits, which were always a cock tease, where they showed the really kick-ass box arts, which were from motorized tanks that were no longer even remotely close to being in production at the time these kits were still around. These ones here were very prolific and were very easily come by without a whole lot of effort. So we have the Ribblewind, the Stug 4, the Brumbar, as well as the Jagd Panzer. And believe it or not, I've actually built an example of every one of these, and they are found in my tank collection. Some of which need the OTR treatment, but again, that's information for another video for another day. Kit number is, in case anyone is interested, 35096 *2500. And there we have the Tamiya USA importation information right over there on top of the logo. So cracking open the box, hopefully the kit's intact. Again, this is the type of cardstock you will see on these Tamiya kits. Also, one last thing I want to mention in case anyone is a hardcore Tamiya, vintage Tamiya kit collector out there. If you're seeing one of these kits and you think the guy's trying to pull a fast one, saying, oh, you know, it's an original one. Again, the cardstock is the #1 thing to look for, as is the importer information. The old kits would have had MRC on them. These ones would have Tamiya USA, as well as also made in the Philippines. But of course, the #1 thing to easily determine if this kit is a legit made in Japan release, or if it's a newer one, is, again, the color of the cardstock. The other ones originally would have had a white background just like this. However, after, 40 plus years or so, the cardstock is going to be yellowish in color, and this is something that could definitely be seen on the older example kits that are floating around on the market. So that is something to consider if, again, you're a collector. If you're not into collecting this type of stuff, or you just, want to buy it just to build it, obviously this information is not really relevant. But it is a data point out there. I just want to put it out there for all to take in. All right, so with the box out of the way, here you get to see the inner contents right here. So the kit obviously is the exact same tooling from the other examples, but I just want to mention the one difference with the lower hull. I take out this nice little steel little baggie over here, which, by the way, I don't think was done on the older kits. This is something that is more akin of a newer production model. But if we look here at the inside information, you will see, hopefully this comes out in focus, the Tamiya logo, and we have this nice little protruding oval right there. That originally would have said made in Japan, and then we have the copyright 1975 right next to it. When the kits were moved to the Philippines, they needed to remove that little bit of verbiage, so they just took the mold and they milled out this little slot right there that contained the made in Japan information. The other bit of information that was added was this little oval that we have right over here with these numbers on it. This is something that was not found on the original example and was done when the kits were moved to the Philippines for further manufacturing. Outside of that nerdy information, nothing much to go over here. It's your standard old school Tamiya Panzer IV hull. Of course, I go into more depth in this information in the other video. I recommend checking that one out if you haven't already done so. As for the runners, again, they are made out of the exact same Panzer Gray color plastic as we've seen on the other examples. And when it comes to looking at these runners over here to know if it's a legit version from the earlier release, you look right here on the information tab where we have the Tamiya logo as well as also the runner number. But right over here, you have a nice little milled out oval just like on the hull, and this would have had the made in Japan information, obviously made in the Philippines, that was modified to the way you see it here. And on the back of the runner, you're going to have some more information. The top verbiage is original, however the 2 codes on the bottom are not. This was again done with the Philippines move. The exact same information and modification was done to all of the runners, so it's pretty easy to determine if or if not the piece is originally molded in Japan or if it was one of the later production units. So no point going over the rest of this. This is all thoroughly mentioned in the other videos. Also, I briefly glossed over it before. And this takes us to the bottom of the box where we have the really excellent single piece vinyl tracks. And this is something that you will see on modern produced Tamiya kits, which is this nice little sheet over here with some marketing about just basic information about tools and other things along those lines. And it's just one of those things that just scream Japanese. Now, the Japanese were always excellent showmen on their model kits, and this is, you know, an example of what I mean by that. They're really cool. These are the type of things you see on Tamiya kits, or I've seen on Tamiya kits, that have been, you know, basically on the market now for the last 5 or 10 years or so. And the last time I ran into this was actually on a Walker Bulldog that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, and it had this in it, and that was basically a hot off the press kit. Instructions, absolutely the same. Nothing much to go over here. This is also something that's pretty new. This has to do with Japanese, with the way their recycling system works, where the pieces are indicated made out of polystyrene. The little PS logo is also a new addition done to the runners. This was something that was done in about the last 20 so years, and it just has to do with, you know, how to dispose of the runners if you live in Japan. It also says over here, it's actually a warning for heating these components up to stretch them out so you can make your antennas out of them. And apparently it could make a toxic gas, so that's good to know. Luckily, I don't use that technique for my antennas. I use metal wire. We have 2 instructions here because this is a kit of its era, where one set of instructions is written in Japanese while the other one is written in the other languages. This is a staple found on the older generation kits from the late 1970s. The other last thing I want to mention about the different generations is with the decal sheet. So this kit here, which was from the bagged one, this is something that was released in the 1990s time frame, while this one here was manufactured very, very recently. The difference is not with so much the file itself that was used to have the markings on, but it's with the cardstock. You can see that over the years, Tamiya changed the paper backing that was used on their decal sheets. This is also one other thing I want to mention is with the earlier production units, the paper is actually not blue, but it is white on a lot of examples. So too bad I don't have that kit on hand right now, but you would see the white one, this shade of blue, and then the current shade of blue. The quality decals have not changed. They are all really, really good from my past experience with building these Tamiya models. But this is something, again, to pay attention to if you are the type of person that is looking to buy and collect old school Tamiya kits. This one here is from the 80s and 90s, while this one here is from the current era. The other difference may also be the verbiage. Let's see. Yep, this one here was actually produced in 2001, right over there. And this one here, they changed the verbiage where they got rid of the copyright information that stated the date. So that is something else that's very minute and something to check out. It's also the type of information no one really cares to discuss in these videos, but again, that's why you tune into this one. Jumping ahead takes us to one of the examples that I've shown before on the table, but at this point here, it's very close to the painting point. And there are a few things I want to mention at this time, because once it crosses over, it's going to be really hard to really appreciate it in that final form. So, as for which one this one is, this is actually the bagged version of the Panzer IV kit, and this one here is being built as the DAK variant. And so it has the DAK parts that are supplied with the kit installed in place. As for the other one, that one's a bit further behind than this one. As you can see, it's still mostly on the sprues. I am doing the body work here on the lower hull, as obviously it's a very early point here. And you can also see I've already assembled the exhaust manifold, and this is about to head off into its body work and polishing. But we can set that aside for the time being. Back to this one over here. This unit, like I stated before, is almost ready for painting. However, before I can do that, there are some areas I need to pre-prime, and then I could install a few other components, and then from there, it could slide off into actual paint. But before I can do that, I might as well mention some things about this build at this time. So first is going back to what I showed before with the lower hull. Here you can see the lower hull section with the bodywork completed. As I mentioned before, there are these holes found in the side sections here for the motorization. There are also found on the bottom. The bottom ones don't really concern me, but the ones on the side are obviously way more visible, so those are something that I always address. To plug these up, I utilize just a little bit of Plastruct square stock right over here. I basically file it to shape with a needle file. That's used to then glue into these sections over here. Once the pieces are glued in place, this gives me a good backing to continue the remainder of the bodywork. This would include both the use of sandpaper as well as also red putty. Once the red putty is set, everything is polished down with both wet and dry sanding in order to get the appearance that you see here. Obviously, this needs to be done before the upper and lower hulls get assembled because, well, it makes it a bit easier, and the same is also true, needless to say, for the suspension. You definitely don't want to do this before the suspension or after suspension is fitted in place. Can it be done? Yes, it can. As a matter of fact, I'm doing another one of these as an OTR, and yes, that one is going through the motions, but let's just say it's easier done before all this is completed. But regardless, that's been taken care of. Once that's been taken care of, the only thing I want to mention on the hulls are with the underside of the sponsons. This kit here, and this is true for many other Tamiya kits specifically of the past, they do not have full sponsons, and they're open in these areas over here. As I customarily mention on my builds, I like to plug these up. It just makes the model just seem more complete, more solid, and it just makes it for a better build in my opinion. In order to do this, I actually made a template. I go over the template in the other model showcase video for the exact same kit, and I show exactly how I trace these sections out on some masking tape, transfer those to styrene, cut them out, and then glue them in place. This one here, and it seems going to be true for the other one, are no exception. Also at this time, I went ahead and you'll notice I pre-primed the grill section over here, as well as also the rear sections of the tin work that get plugged in place. Again, this has to do with just the limited access into these locations over here. You can easily have missed paint areas or missed primer areas, and this is something that is just very commonplace on these Panzer IV vehicles. With the way the grills are designed, there's a lot of nooks and crannies, and it's actually quite difficult to get paint in there thoroughly. So while I'm doing the build, I like to temporarily take a moment to mask everything up, spray paint it with some flat black, because I use that as my primer, and then I just, let it dry. Once it's dry, I continue with the remainder of the construction. Same is also true for the tin work, because again, it's right over here. I might as well pre-prime those. It makes things a bit easier. On the tin work, on the bottom portions, the kit actually has quite a number of holes that are present just for the molding, and these are something that can hurt the look of the model, so I plugged them up with a little bit of putty and sanded them smooth. This was actually done before the things got primed, and after the primer was completed, it just blended everything in. Same is also true for several other injection pins found on the lower portion of the tin work. This is admittedly optional, but it's one of those things that just makes me feel better knowing that I accomplished. On a similar note, when it comes for bodywork, we have here the exhaust manifold. As I mentioned before, it is a two-piece, actually it's a multi-piece assembly, but the most relevant sections are the two halves for the main trunk itself, and these were polished down with a needle file and some sandpaper. And then, as I always mention, I like to pre-prime everything just to make sure there are no hidden surprises with seams popping out. If everything's a go, it then continues with the remainder of construction. For this one over here, you get to see what it looks like going through that point. These sections have been glued together. It's been a while now since I glued them together, so I could take off the jigs. But if you are, as a quick handy note, if you are working on one of these models or any Panzer IV variant and it has a two-piece assembly, it would help to have some sort of a clamp like these ones here. These ones here I picked up from Tractor Supply in their dollar tool bin section. And these things are absolutely awesome for plastic models. I always use them. One of the better investments I've bought in tools for a little while. They can be found anywhere from Tractor Supply to Harbor Freight, Amazon, definitely all of them. They have everything. But these things are really, really recommended. If, say, you're working on a shoestring budget and you don't have access to these really awesome clamps on hand, best thing to do is clothespins. Just borrow some clothespins from your mom or wife, and they'll do the job equally as efficiently. And for the longest time, I've been using clothespins. But these things are admittedly a step up. But, I also have quite a few clothespins hanging around the shop for good reason. Once these sections are glued together, you can see the seam that is present, and from here they're going to get a little coating of thick super glue. Once that sets, I can then begin to polish with the needle file and sandpaper, and then once it's all done, coat of flat black spray paint. If everything pans out, it can then continue with construction and it'll look like this fella right over here. While on that note, you can see I went ahead and drilled out the toe pin section for the tow hitch. The tow hitch is integrally molded into the Panzer IV on the Tamiya example, but it is molded solid. So, simple trick. Take a pin vise, specifically this one, right over here with this bit, which is number 72, and the size, let me get that on camera, is a 0.0250. And that's an inch. I cannot tell you what that is in metric, but regardless, these bits here are purchased via my vendor, listed below in the video description. And that is what's used to drill this section out right here. Just mark it with a pencil if you have to, and then just carefully just drill it out. If you go ahead and take your time, you'll have the hole drilled out in this area, and it's a great, easy way to enhance the your look on your Tamiya pattern of Panzer IV. Regardless of the kit, be it the H, this one, or any of the other Panzer IV derivatives that Tamiya produce. And yeah, they produce quite a bit, as I mentioned before. Back to the side tin work. There is a small little gap found in these two sections here because they are separate moldings. On this one here, I had a little swipe of red putty and polished it down. There may not necessarily be a seam in these sections here on the vehicle, depending on the vehicle's background, but it just, you know, while you're at it, you might as well just take care of it. On this top section, it blends in pretty well with the way it assembles. There's this guard, or this support right over here, and it bridges the gap perfectly, and it just eliminates the seam. It's clever engineering on Tamiya's hand on that one. Continuing further takes us to some of the, well, because this is the bag kit here, it did have several issues with it that needed to have been remedied. So, as I mentioned before, the hatches were busted or were just chewed up on the original tooling. And rather than trying to salvage them, it was easier for me to just take an example of the hatch from the other kit here, make a mold of it, and then cast two fresh ones out of cast resin. They are direct copies of the original, so they will look absolutely perfect once everything is painted and weathered. As you can see, since they are just copies of the Tamiya ones, or the original tooling, I should say, once the pieces are cleaned up from any sort of flash or their sprues, they just get glued in place, and they just go on exactly as the kit originally intended. The remainder of the details here are all stock, nothing really much to go over here at this point. The other thing I do want to mention, this is a quirk found with this version, the ausf.D pattern of kit from Tamiya, is they have this notch in the upper hull right here. If I go ahead and grab the pristine example, you get to see what I'm talking about. So here we have this notch in this location, and if I didn't know any better, I would say that this notch here is a carryover from one of the other Panzer IV kits, namely the H, where I believe it has that air filter system found on the side, and this here is just a artifact from that tooling. And for this kit here, that notch is actually bad because there is no notch found on the real vehicle. And there's nothing included with the kit to plug it up. So if you're working on one of these models, it would really be a great idea to plug this section up. It will actually improve the model immensely. So to plug this section up, I used a little bit of Plastrux stock, glued it into this section over here, and then polished it down. This was done before the side armor plate was fitted in place. You can still do it with the armor present, but it's going to make it just a little bit trickier to do, but it's something that can still be done regardless. When you install the piece and you're polishing it down, you don't necessarily have to spend too much time on the side portion, because obviously it's going to get plated over with the bolt-on armor, but you don't want to have a lump sticking or protruding from the surface, so as long as it's nice and smooth, it should be fine. You don't have to worry about the little seam. Obviously, that's not going to be relevant once the plate goes on. Where that does become relevant, of course, is on the top, and this is where you want to spend a little time and making sure that that area there is thoroughly polished down with some super glue or putty or whatever seam removal trick that you choose. Some wet sanding here, and then the piece is nice and polished down, as you can see. Soon I'll have some paint on that, so we'll see if it's actually as seamless as I can tell at this point, but that remains to be seen. So, anything else to mention here? Oh, the wheel mounts. These are actually pretty tricky to glue on, believe it or not. There's no, like, actual plugs or anything. They just kind of haphazardly get glued to the side. So you do have to be aware of the locations, because obviously if they're too close to the tank's hull, when it comes time for insertion of the spare wheels, it's going to be a bit problematic. It's not going to fit very well. So you have to basically go by feel on that. 2 little drops of glue on these sections here, and then I also had a little thin drop of really fine, thin super glue on the bottom portion there, just to solidify it in place and prevent it from potentially wiggling around. Once it's all painted and the wheels are fit in place, it should do the job pretty well. One other interesting quirk is with the antenna rail here. This is wood on the real unit, and on the model here there are no suggestion points where this thing gets fitted in place. It just has a drawing in the instructions, and you basically more or less have to wing it. When you're doing it, you want to make sure that it's at the proper height, and if you look at the model here, this is actually where the part's supposed to go on the kit. So it's right very close to those fasteners that we have right over there. And here's the end location. Remember, on the real unit, this here would pivot down, so you want to have that clearance factored in. It's not really a proper science, but basically you just have to more or less eyeball it, and once you get it in place, just let the glue set and you should be good to go. For the antenna bracket itself, this has been drilled out with a pin vise with that same bit that I mentioned before. This is because when it comes time for completion, I install the wire in place for the antenna, and with the way the kit is, it has a little notch cut into this section over here. And this is customarily seen on other Tamiya kits from this era, but if you drill it out, it makes for a stronger mount for the wire. If you try to just glue anything into this section over here, specifically wire, it doesn't really hold it all that well, and chances are really likely the antenna can pop off over time. But if you actually drill into the section, it's much stronger, and you're not going to have to worry about that when it comes time for putting in an actual metal wire. Carrying on to the turret, and this is where, like I stated before, everything is not quite finished just yet. So one thing to note about the Panzer IV turret from this kit is that it doesn't really plug together very securely compared to some other kits that I've worked on in the past. It is a 2/2 assembly, and when you're gluing the section together, it could want to wiggle on you, so there's no real like notch and groove type assembly that really holds it in place and allows the glues to set in their appropriate locations. So because of that, you want to make sure when you're gluing this together that the piece is jigged appropriately so that once the glue's set, everything is where it needs to be. To do this, the front plate is not installed yet, neither is the roof. I basically just glue the 2/2 together, and with some clamps over here, I basically jig it in place. When I get to the other one, we'll see what it looks like exactly at that point, so you know what I'm referring to. But once the glues are set, it's then time to polish away some seams. On the rear section of the turret here, there is a seam that runs along this section. This is probably the biggest work, I should say, on this kit, is blending in that seam, making sure it's nice and smooth. And on this kit, it's extremely relevant, specifically if you're going with the Panzer Gray variants, where it doesn't have the bin in place. Obviously, having a seam over there is going to really kick you in the nuts, and it's going to really hurt the look of the build. So you definitely want to pay attention to that. The remainder of the turret's detailing goes on pretty well. There are some interesting suggestion points here for the little hooks. They haven't been glued on yet because of what I'm going to be doing next. The hooks are present with the kit. They're separately molded, and that's nice, but there's no real suggestion points where to glue them in place. So this is something you're going to have to stay on the ball with and just eyeball, making sure everything's at the exact same height, the proper location, and it's a mirror image from one another. Again, this is probably some of the hardest aspects of this kit, which if anyone's built some more advanced kits out there, they're going to be laughing right now. As for the mantlet, the front plate here gets glued on in place, as does the turret. Goes on pretty well. However, the fit isn't exactly perfect. There's, again, no suggestion points, so you're basically just like eyeballing and just shifting around until it finds its sweet spot. On the plate here, I found that it's not exactly to the same dimensions as the turret, so it's a slight bit of material that needs to be added. And otherwise you will have quite a noticeable little seam on where the sections meet. This is easily remedied with some red putty and some super glue, which, as you can see over here, has been already polished down, and then making everything more appropriate. However, if you do that, there are some welds molded into these sections over here. Those are not going to survive, and you are going to have to re-etch those. On this example here, I re-etched them with the Dremel, and I basically use one of these small little bits here, but it was actually a broken one, and I love keeping some of my broken bits because they're great for sculpting on the welds. I carefully drew everything out with a pencil, and then I carefully went here and the little weld beads, and then once sanded down, it leaves for the result that we have here, and it'll look much better once everything's painted, and most importantly, once the panel line accent gets fitted in place. The welds were added through all these sections over here, and then I also had to add the weld on the triangle section because this was, again, collateral damage and was lost during the bodywork phase. On the top section, you'll see that there are two metal wires. The kit does supply you with plastic ones. However, one of the plastic handles just flung off the Lost Partia. So because of that, I had to just fabricate 2 new ones. I always like to replace them all if I lose one because it makes for better continuity and just blends in better as opposed to having one metal and one plastic. Even though the metal is the same diameter as the plastic one, it always seems like it'll stick out. So that's why when one goes, you might as well pitch them both. The holes were just drilled out with a pin vise through and through, and then new metal wires were just bent to shape and then fit in place for the look that we have here. Once everything's painted and weathered, it'll just blend right in. That's really all there is to the turret. This brings us to the mantlet. The mantlet is a multi-part assembly, and this section here is a 2-piece assembly, so there was some seam work, again, that had to be contended with. This has been addressed, and I'm about to glue on the 75. The reason why this has not been installed yet at this time is because, again, of the bodywork. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mask up the turret. I'm actually going to add a little quick shot of spray paint to the back section and to the front section, not to mention to the mantlet itself. This is for twofold. First, well, the whole tank is going to get primed anyway, but the first is to make sure and double check and verify there's no seam present in this area, and I did a good job with the flare-in. For the front section, this is more or less done because once the paint gets, or once the mantlet gets fitted in place, you're not exactly going to get a whole lot of access in here to get the paint in, so I might as well pre-prime and paint it at this time before the final installation. Also, again, for this here, just to verify to making sure that the seams have been addressed. Even though this one here will get the storage box, which will be fitted somewhere in this location when the time comes, this too needs to be pre-primed because, again, I want to make sure everything is pre-painted or is thoroughly painted. That's a common theme if you may be noticing on these videos. So, okay, and with that, there's not much more to go over here. So this guy here is going to slide into the next step. And then from there, I can actually focus back here on this guy. One last thing I want to mention involves the row wheel. So this runner here I took out of the bag momentarily. So as I mentioned before, the hubcap and the row wheel moldings are 2 separate parts and they need to be assembled. And what's interesting to point out that this is the only time on the old school Tamiya kits from the 70s, specifically their Panzer IV kits, that this was the case. And it's something that I guess gives you for some nice detail fidelity, but it's not really relevant to why they did that because the old tooling would have been able to do this just fine. Regardless, one thing that I did was I already snipped off all the hubs and I glued them to their appropriate locations at this time before the model goes off into paint. Why this is important? Well, as you'll notice, I actually paint the row wheels as separate parts and then I assemble them at the tail end after the rubber tires have already been painted. This is to ensure that, you guessed it, everything is thoroughly painted and there's no missed areas. With the way these wheels are, and this is true for just about most tank kits, when you assemble the road wheel, you will have these, sections glued together, and trying to get paint into these areas can be problematic. So again, it's easier done in this format, and then you assemble it at the tail end. So this one here is no different. Because this one here has that third component, I might as well install that at this time because it just simplifies everything, having this assembled at this point of the build, as trying to paint all these components as 3 separate parts is completely just not necessary. The only time maybe that might be handy is if you're going to do something crazy and you want the hubcaps to be a slightly different color of Panzer Gray or a different color altogether compared to the remainder of the hub, but for this build here, that's not going to be the case, so I might as well just glue them on at this time. I believe there are a few dragging kits of the Panzer IV that were similar, and if memory serves, I actually did the same procedure for the exact same reasons. So, enough said about that. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and get this guy into paint like I said before, and then I could focus on this fella. So let's go ahead and continue on. So with the other vehicle in dry time, I went ahead and now I'm focusing more on the other example. So here you can see right off the gate, I'm already starting with the bodywork. Like I mentioned before, there were some pin marks and other big divots found in these sections over here under the tin work, and they've been, or I should say, they're going through their process of getting plugged up with the red putty. For the red putty, I'm utilizing this stuff here. Link for this can be found on the Amazon link listed below. So the putty is applied, and the way I apply it is actually with this little spatula here. This is sold in art supply stores for mixing paint or sculpting clay, and I've been using this one for many, many years now, as one may be able to determine. It works really well for this type of application here. It allows you to apply the putty in a surgical manner, which obviously is important because this stuff is tooling based, and you only want to expose certain areas of the plastic to the putty at any given time. So it's really good to get into these little recesses. With the way the tin work is on the Panzer IV, we have this little leading lip over here. So you want to make sure you don't get any putty onto that lip, as it'll make removal a bit more problematic. So that's going on over here. The bottom portions of the tinwork inserts are also getting their putty job at this time. This is what it looks like stock. As I mentioned before, we have all these nice little divots found in these sections here, as well as some knockout marks, and I'm just plugging them up. You don't have to do this. It shows one of those things, again, just makes me feel better knowing that I did it on my build. Again, to do that, I got the red putty right here and my little spatula. Take a nice little glob like that, and I just smear it into the appropriate location, as you can see. This is something that obviously, again, is easier done before these are installed in place, which is why I go ahead and do it at this point of the build. If you have a built model and you're going through the same modification, it can still be done, only it's going to require a little bit more time, a little bit more effort. Oop. But, nope, that putty's gone. It will require a little bit more time and a little bit more effort in order to achieve, but it can still be done regardless. On this one here, you want to make sure you don't have too much oozing out right over there. And if that is the case, you can just plunk it out with a needle or wire or whatever you have on hand. Also, you want to make sure you don't get too much on the outside portion. This is something I'm going to have to remedy, but it's best done after it sets. If I try to mess with it now, again, the plastic is right now a little bit soft in this section because of the tooling, so it's best messed with after it's dried. Once it's dried out, you can just polish away with a little precision sanding, and you're good to go. But I'm just go ahead and just add the swipes in here. As you can see how I'm applying it, here goes that lip that I was talking about before on the side of the tinwork, and I am just carefully just making sure I don't put too much on there. I can just smear it in where it needs to go. Just like so. Looks a bit messy and ugly at this point, but remember, that's why we have Mr. Sandpaper, who will remedy it from that point onward. And, okay, so these guys are all puttied up. I'm going to clean off the spatula and, well, continue with the remainder of the build, which will be yet more body work. I'm going to be taking care of the exhaust, no point getting that on camera, so let's just continue. Like I mentioned before, when it comes time for gluing the turret halves together, on this kit here, it leaves a little room for improvement, but it can still be done regardless, and relatively easily. So the two halves have been removed off of the sprue. They've also been partially cleaned, where I needle file down the small burr found on the rear section here. There's another burr found on this area, but this one I could deal with a little bit easier once it's already assembled. So at this point, you can see the glue again has been added. Then you just mate the two sections together. Find that little magic sweet spot right there, and then they plug. Like I stated before, there's no real like positive clicking or connecting type feature, so it's a very shallow type installation. This is where use of super glue is going to become pretty handy because of the speed that it bonds, and also with the strength that it does have. And honestly, at this point, I'm just going to set the thing aside like this right here on the table, making sure I'm visually inspecting that everything is lining up accordingly, specifically on the back area here. And that's it. I'm just going to let it dry. So once the super glue sets and the turret is more or less one piece, I'm going to go ahead and add the super glue and make a bead on the inside over here on these two sections, and that will give added strength. This is going to be important because you're going to need that extra strength when it comes time for doing the body work on the rear section. Admittedly, if you glue the roof on shortly after the halves are glued together, I mean when they're already solid, it does give extra backbone and extra support, so it will prevent the turret from falling apart on you. But regardless, even when I do that, the bead of glue on these two sections here are still very important, and I can't recommend that enough. Starting with the model's running gear, the components that you see here are all 100% stock and utilized out of the box. These parts go together extremely well and pretty much effortlessly. The one thing about the ausf.D kit from Tamiya that I mentioned before is that the hubcaps are a separate molding from the remainder of the tire, which is again a bit different compared to the other kits from the era. But these parts go together very well, and once are fitted in place, actually make the wheel look very, very detailed. And again, it's one of those aspects on this kit that actually aged pretty well. It's also on this point of the model where you get to see, or you shouldn't be able to see, that hole that was molded into the lower portion of the hull over here. As I mentioned earlier, this was something that was addressed via the bodywork, and now that the models are thoroughly completed, the area is totally smooth without any sort of trace or remnants left over from that original motorization hole. This is one of the biggest dings, in my opinion, on the older generation Panzer IV kits, but it's one that can be readily taken care of with just a little bit of extra bodywork and some elbow grease. You go ahead and do that, and the kit's quality jumps up tenfold. Same can also be said about the underside here of the tin work. As I mentioned before, the kit does have some injection holes and pins molded into this section over here, and although this is not very visible, it's one of those things that once it's polished away, it again improves the model immensely. And it's one of those things where after you make the modification to it, it's definitely one that's much more appreciated. One other thing that I forgot to mention that I added to the build that's actually quite important are the underhull sponsons. As we saw before, the old school Tamiya kit, and also this is true for many of the newer tooling Tamiya kits, are sponsonless for one reason or another. And I always thought that this was a ding on these kits, and it's always one that, when improved, improves the model tenfold. So, the same, by the way, is true for all the other Panzer IV ausf.Ds that I've done, including the last video that was posted recently. The DAK version also had the exact same modification. And what did that entail? Well, quite simply put, I went ahead and fabricated the underhull sponson. Now, admittedly, when the tracks are assembled, you can't really see into this section over here, but it's one of those things that always irked me on these older school and even newer school Tamiya kits. By adding the sponson, this does two things. First, it makes the model more accurate, and the second thing that it does is that it gives the model a bit more rigidity. And when you have the model with the sponsons in place and everything is glued together, it does make for a more solid build because everything, of course, is self-supporting each other. As for the components themselves, well, the way it's done, and I believe I referenced this in the other video, but we have some plaster angle on the inside portions over here, and this acts as a shelf for the styrene section to be glued to. As for the styrene, I went ahead and made a template where I took some masking tape and I went over this section here with a pencil, and now this gives me the exact cut that I need to make. This was transferred over onto styrene. The sections were cut, glued in place, and the styrene angle over here acts as a shelf and gives extra support for the glues to adhere. And also sets the thing to the appropriate height, no less. Once that's all taken care of, the upper and lower hulls are permanently glued together, leaving for the end result that you see presently. If I was making this thing motorized, of course the upper and lower hulls need to be able to come apart, but if you do have the motorized version and that is something that you want to do, fear not, you can still add the sponsons to the top section and still have the upper and lower hulls disassemble as intended. On that note, the hooks that are used to secure the upper and lower in place for the motorization use are recycled. I go ahead and install those components because these act as extra contact points for the glues to adhere to when I'm sealing and boxing everything up. Although admittedly it's a bit sad when I'm gluing these things together because they are supposed to disassemble, but again, since this model is never going to be made motorized, there's no point to have the upper and lower hulls disengaged, so everything was used to as a glue point. But that is something to keep in mind if you are working on one of the older Panzer IVs, either from Tamiya or from Academy. This is one thing that you can do to make the model a bit more sturdier and a bit more secure. At the addition of the sponsons, and also when you're gluing in place, be sure to recycle the motorization clip sections that I believe I mentioned in the other video. Also, jumping ahead briefly, but here you can see the model with the antenna fitted in place. Like I said before, I use 4-wire for that, and for good reason. It's much more stronger compared to plastic, and because I drilled the section out over here, this also gives for extra rigidity, and on a model like this, you're going to appreciate that. First, when I'm filming, I've bumped into this thing a countless number of times, and when it does get bumped into, it just simply bends out of the way, or bends, then I have to carefully eke it back straight. But also, with the location of this one here, this is beyond snag prone from just your handling, like I mentioned before, but also with taking and revolving the turret. When you're taking off a turret on a Panzer IV ausf.D, you want to make sure that you rotate it this way so that you can rotate the turret to the lock section and allow you to take the turret off or put it back on, or vice versa. When you're rotating the turret, you are somewhat limited in how you can display the piece because of this wire in the way. It tends to snag quite easily. Remember, on the real vehicle, the mount over here is actually a leaf spring assembly, so the wire would actually flex when the turret is rotated. But this is something that is a data point to mention on these early pattern of World War II German tanks. Later on, they moved the antenna to this section over here, which is much more convenient and out of the way, probably for the same reasons that I mentioned now. While still on the running gear, takes us to the rear idler wheels. And the rear idler wheels that are supplied with this kit, they give you two options. And this is something that I mistakenly mislabeled on the previous build video that I did of this exact same kit. As I mentioned in that video, the kit does supply you with two sets of rear idlers. And to the common observer, you'll notice that one of the hubs is larger than the other, and you will think that, well, maybe one version is for a different pattern, or it's a later production or an early production, and that is actually false. What the kit gives you are two options for rear idlers, yes, but the reason why they do that is because one is more to scale than the other. The other kit that I built before, I utilized the rear idler that would be for the ability to hold on a polycap. And why Tamiya gave you this option is because in case you have the desire or the ability to make the model motorized, you can have the rear idler be able to fully function with the polycaps along with the remainder of the road wheels. However, if the builder wants to make it quote-unquote more accurate, you go ahead and utilize this version over here where it does not have the polycap, the rear idler that's permanently glued to the shaft, and it no longer is capable of spinning. But this gives you the correct size hubcap that is found on the idler. And although this is an interesting bit of accessory, it's one that's also a bit puzzling because, as I mentioned in the other video, even though this kit had the lower hull had the provisions of being motorized, and the upper hull has the ability to lock on in a tab type format so you can remove it to get access to the batteries, for one reason or another, the ausf.D kit, as far as I know, was never released by Tamiya in a motorized or a two-wire remote fashion. So it's kind of weird that they give you the ability to have a motorized capable rear idler wheel, even though the kits were never offered in that format, which is kind of a sad thing to say, because actually these kits would be pretty cool if they were offered motorized. But if you have access to a gearbox that fits into these models over here, or if you have access to one of the original Tamiya gearboxes for the Panzer IV, you can go ahead and drop that unit into one of these models over here, use the larger rear idler wheel with the hubcap, and you can have the thing run and operate pretty well. So that is something to keep in mind for anyone out there that potentially has a setup like that. For these two over here, they are built in the static configuration. So for these two examples, I went with the quote-unquote scale accurate version of the idler wheel. And the reason why I'm using air quotes on this is because this kit does have lots of mistakes on it, but this is something I'll circle back to later on in the video. But hey, at least Tamiya was trying when they went ahead and putting effort in designing this kit to give you a idler wheel that was more or less to scale compared to just rolling with the polycap version. I will also add that if you are the builder of one of these models, and if you're going to build the model with some playability in mind, obviously you would want to roll with the bigger polycap version as opposed to this one over here, which gets glued on static in place. Of course, this variant of the Panzer IV has rubber tires on not just the road wheels, but also has them on the top return rollers as well. This does differ from later versions of the Panzer IV where the return rollers were all steel. This is something as the builder needs to pay attention to, and you want to paint accordingly. One other thing to mention about the suspension is with the bump stops. The bump stops are built into these Tamiya kits here and are decently rendered. However, one little trick that the builder can do to, again, add a bit of extra flavor and spice to the model is to paint the rubber portions of the bump stop with rubber black or flat black. As you can see on this example here, it really pops out because of the lighter shade of base coat, but it's something that always looks great. Even on the Panzer Gray example, the bump stop color is always one that, again, adds a bit of extra variation and detailing to the build, without you, again, the builder, having to do any more work besides properly paint everything. On a similar note, Same can also be stated about the rear idler wheel. These are steel rimmed and are not rubber rimmed. So when you're weathering a Panzer IV like this, you want to make sure you properly paint the face sections of the wheel with the steel color, because paint on these sections here would wear off very quickly, leaving for just the bare exposed metal sections like you see on the build here. Also, moving forward, takes to the sprocket and the track. The sprockets are actually really good on this model and are one of the better aspects of this kit. I like the way they molded the sprocket tooth ring with those little cutouts that we see here, and overall it's actually a really nicely engineered piece. And this then takes us to the track. The track, again, it's the single-piece vinyl tracks that were on all of the vintage Panzer IV kits from Tamiya from back in the 70s, but the tracks, to their credit, do paint weather very nicely and are nicely detailed. Although, again, for this kit, or I should say this version of the Panzer IV here, it is inaccurate because the real Panzer IV had a narrower gauge of track, and this one here is representing a pattern that was later developed. But either way, the tracks that are supplied with the kit are pretty good for what they are, and if you're just going to stick with the out-of-the-box components, they do build and paint very nicely and are very representable and presentable once the model is fully painted and weathered, like the way you see it here. Carrying rearward takes to the exhaust manifold. This is a nicely designed piece on this kit. Like I mentioned before, it is a multi-piece assembly. When you take your time with thoroughly deleting the seam work that are found on the two half assemblies. Once that's taken care of, the remainder of the assembly goes by like a dream. And the pieces all go into their appropriate locations, as one would imagine. For the secondary exhaust, that's right over here. This, again, you want to follow the instructions, take your time, and the piece goes together very well. As for paint and weathering work, I utilize the same techniques that I utilize on a multitude of my builds, where the rust effects are done with sophisticated finishes rusting agent, and this is done after the model is thoroughly painted, weathered, and after the varnish is applied. You do not want to add this stuff before the model gets varnished. It can have some weird effects that can actually help the build. It can give it some interesting burn char marks, but I personally like to do it afterwards because I have a little bit more control over compared to before. But generally, as a rule of thumb, you do want to add this stuff at the tail end of the build, just before the project is thoroughly completed. Another thing I want to mention about the exhausts are with this little tower that we have here, we have these little canisters, and they have little rubber caps on them, and I went ahead and painted them as such. It's a way to add a little bit extra color and squeeze a little bit of extra accuracy out of the build. The other thing to keep aware of are with the lights as well as the reflectors. So there is a small little reflector integrally molded into the fender over here. This would be red on the real unit, so a little swipe of gloss red was added to this location. On the right hand side, we have this traffic type light, this convoy light, and the colors on them are as follows. The top portion is a orange color, while the bottom lens is painted in gloss red. This is something that's seen on many other vehicles from the early war time frame, specifically the German ones. On the opposite side here, we have the no-tech light. This, again, is kit supplied, and if you're painting a no-tech, be sure to properly paint the lenses. This is something I always harp on these videos, because you'll be surprised how many people out there forget to do this. On the no-tech light, there's this little swiveling plate, and on the bottom portion, we actually have a little half-moon circle. One would be orange, one would be red, much along the lines of this fellow over here. But when the piece is in blackout mode, we have these little squares that are exposed, and the squares are green on the real units. And so I use a little swipe of Tester's Gloss Green, and that is the color that I utilize on a large number of my builds, specifically ones that have the no-tech light. I basically use it every single time for pretty good reasons. By thoroughly painting everything over here, this gives both extra added accuracy to the model that you, the builder, don't have to do any sort of extra scratch building for. And when you don't have to scratch build anything, that's always a good day. But on top of that, it also gives the model some extra color pop. In the end, it just helps out in every which way imaginable. Carrying on takes to the side hull detailing. Now, in this example over here, I modeled the vehicle with the applicant armor fitted in place. And because this one is the DAK version, the DAK version would have the extra grille cutouts along with the applicant armor. I'm not sure, as far as my knowledge goes, where it had the grille cutouts with the original armor in its original configuration. Generally, when I see these patterns of vehicles, they tend to have both of those modifications. So for this one here, I simply just added the kit-supplied applicant armor to the appropriate locations. And if memory serves, the kit gives you the applicant armor sections for the sides, the front corner section over here, as well as also the front armor plate. The one thing that I do want to stress though is that when you're mounting these sections in place, there really isn't any sort of indication marks on where these panels go, so you basically have to fit it and use your eyeball to make sure everything is appropriate. The reason why this is important is because one common mistake I've seen on this kit in particular, done by a lot of guys out there, is that when they're applying the applicant armor, they just basically plate over the entire front section over here, which can easily be done, but you have to use your head, because if you do that, you lose access to the direct vision port, and that's the only way the driver can actually see to operate the vehicle. So when you're building one of these kits and you're doing the applicant armor, be sure not to cover up the driver's section. The way you see it here is how it's supposed to be mounted appropriately, where we have the armor on each section, basically a little sliver left over here from the vision port, as well as the two little backup ports right there on the top. On that note, all three of these sections here have a little swipe of gloss black in order to replicate the Panzer glass, which would of course be found on the real units. As for the machine gun section, this goes on without any problems, and basically just follow the instructions and you should be okay. On the side sections over here, one thing that I do want to mention, and this is something that can easily be made as a mistake, is with the side panels. These do look reversible, however they are not. The rivet pattern is unique to the left and right hand side, and if you're just going through the motions, you can accidentally mount these components on either on the opposite side, or you can even mount it upside down, neither of which is something that is okay. Fortunately, these pieces are properly represented and mentioned in the instructions, so you just want to pay attention to the instructions and you'll be fine. As for the orientation on this one over here, there's actually a small little indication point molded in this section for the use of the antenna, so this is something that will help you with the actual alignment. Outside of the armor sections, one other thing to watch out for are the little lift hooks that are found right here on the front. These are separately molded parts and are something that are very frail and can easily go to lost partia. And if that happens, you're screwed, because the kit does not give you any spares. It only gives you enough to equip one model, which would include the two on either sides here of the front, as well as the two on either sides here of the turret. And on that note, the turret ones, again, don't really have any indication points, so you have to more or less eyeball the thing to make sure it's in the appropriate location. Back to the side hull details. Continuing along takes us to this little section that we have right here. As I mentioned before, there is a small little notch that's integrally molded into this area, and this is something that's a mistake and needs to be plugged up by the builder. For whatever reason, there is no detail that gets found in this area, and the reason why that notch is there is a bit of a mystery, because it's not there on the real vehicle. Luckily, it's really easily taken care of, like I showed before, with a little bit of Plastruct and some CA, as well as some sanding, but this is best done before the armor plate gets fitted in place. You can still do it with the armor plate fitted, but it's a bit easier without, shall we say. But once the bodywork is concluded, as you can see, it definitely improves the model. To compare and contrast, let me go ahead and swap this one out with the Panzer Gray one, and this version here, I built it without any of the armor sections fitted, and this one here is built with the very early production configuration that the kit can be rendered in. And the layout does change somewhat with the tools, as well as also with some of the other fittings, namely the front direct visor. So on the Panzer IV section here on the front, we do have this little sun guard located in this area over here, and this is kit supplied. However, if you're building it with the armor fitted in place, you do not have that part glued on, and you omit it entirely. This is something, again, someone could easily make the mistake, because when you're going through the motions, in the instructions it shows them gluing this component in place, and then it shows with the addition of the applicant armor. What they should mention, and I think they do, is that if you're going to render it with the armor, this piece is optional. You just forego it, but if you're rendering without the armor, it just gets fitted in place. And to be fair, I believe that is mentioned in the instructions. So again, you want to pay attention, and when you're building one of these models, you want to know exactly beforehand which ones you're rendering. Fortunately, if you accidentally glue the thing in place and you want to put the armor on, it's not a problem. This piece just pops right off. You may have to do a little bit of sanding just where the original glue marks were, but by and large, it's something that breaks off quite cleanly if the need be arises. But other than that, the other thing to mention is with the layout here of the tools. So this kit does have a couple different options of exactly how the tools get fitted in place. This one here, you notice that the side section is completely bare and naked, while on this one here, we have this area being taken up by the cleaning staves, and this is an option that is mentioned in the instructions. The cleaning staves, I believe, get fitted into this location, specifically with the DAK variant, because of the spare tire rack that gets mounted right over here. Normally, on the Panzer IV, the stave mounts actually are fitted in this section, but obviously this is the rendering without any of the spare tires, like I have on this example. As for the reverse side, there's really nothing that changes between the two. It's identical, more or less. The only thing is, if you are building it without the armor in place, you want to make sure where the antenna base gets fitted. I'm not sure, but I don't remember or recall if there was any sort of molded in indication points on where this piece gets fitted. So again, you're going to want to go ahead and just basically use your eye and by feel and know exactly where this piece gets fitted in place. I may be wrong on that. It has been a little while since I built this one. But either way, this is what it looks like without the armor fitted. And here we have the up-armored variant. Obviously, it does add a bit of extra detailing, but if you already have one or two in this configuration over here, it can't hurt to build one with the armor absent. The other thing I want to mention is with the trough that we have right over here for the antenna. This is something that is seen on many early war pattern of German tanks, from the Panzer II to the Panzer III, and obviously the Panzer IV is no exception. And one thing that a lot of people don't know or think about is that the channel is actually made out of wood. So if you're building and weathering one of these models over here, you don't want to weather it as if the piece is made out of metal. You want to weather it as if it's wood, and the way I do is with a little bit of dark brown, and I dry brush it onto the locations over here, giving for the end result and with that distressed look. The little straps that you see would be made out of metal, so you want to render it accordingly. And when you're done, it'll actually add a bit of extra color to the build as opposed to just leaving everything overpainted. One other thing to mention about the DAK variant is that you do have quite a bit of artistic licensing on extra add-ons, and these are again all supplied with the kit. Notice on this one here, I have 2 spare tires fitted in place. You can also only mount one on if desired. And one thing that's also supplied with the kit that I omitted on this one here, because frankly I just don't like the look of it, is this little field modification of a fabricated rack located in this area over here that allows you to mount on jerry cans. This is something that is optional. Me personally, I omitted it, but hey, if that's something that you're into, rock on. You can just go ahead and build it out of the box, and the piece should just drop into this location right here. That is, again, only if you're rendering with the DAK variant. I am unaware, or I'm pretty sure that the Panzer Gray variant, specifically this earlier production one over here, that rack would not be in existence, and it's something that was exclusively done in North Africa. Moving our way to the front of the model takes us to the transmission axis hatches, as well as also with the main crew hatches themselves. And as I showed before, one of these examples, the units are original, and the other one, I needed to have a duplicate replacement casted in resin. And now that both units are completed, you cannot tell which one is the original and which one is the cast resin duplicate. And that is, again, when things are done properly. As for which one's which, drum roll please, that would be the North Africa one. This is the one that was in the bag, and 2 of these hatches here are actually cast resin copies. And the pieces are a complete dead ringer, and again, that's done by design. If you go ahead and can tell which one's which, then you definitely need to re-hit the drawing board, because you done goofed. But when everything is done properly, yep. Also on the front section over here, I went ahead and drilled out the MG34s with a very small bit on a pin vise. This again is something that I hazard against if you don't have the equipment and you don't have the experience with. Because of how small everything is, you can easily screw it up. So if you do not have those prerequisites, just leave it alone and leave it stock. It's better to do that than to attempt to drill it and screw it up. Same thing is also done, by the way, to the coax MGs for the exact same reason, with the exact same results, and also again with the exact same warning. Bouncing back to the side takes us to a unique bit of detailing found on this early version of the Panzer IV, and that is the crew lift ladder that we have right here. And what's interesting is that the kit supplies you with 2 of these units, and why that's interesting is because literally only one gets mounted on the model. There are no provisions at all for mounting on a second one. So as for why is there a second one, your hunch is as good as mine. I guess in a way it's a good thing in case this piece is broken or if it's snag prone. You do have a spare, but the likelihood of that happening once the model is fully built and you're leaving it static in the display case is very, very remote. But again, it is a data point I want to mention regardless. The other thing I do want to mention is that on the vehicles, the real ones, these are actually hinged, and when the vehicle enters or starts moving or enters into combat, these are not in the configuration that you see here. This one here actually just folds up and stows in this section with a tie-down strap. And on this one here, I did not render in that format for the simple reason that, well, I frankly like it with the ladder in the deployed state. If you are going to render it in the upright position, this can, of course, be done, but you do have to, I believe, do a little bit of extra scratch building to make a little strap. It can be done, but for this one here, I just like it leaving it in the format that we have it. Also, while in this area, I do want to mention a little bit of the paintwork on the tools. So here we have the cleaning staves, and one common feature that I'd mentioned in these videos is when you're painting your staves, be sure to paint them in the format that we have here, because it's, again, a very easy way to squeeze out more accuracy out of the build without doing any sort of extra work, in terms of scratch building, that is. So on the German World War II AFV staves, the rods are actually made out of wood, and so they are painted and rendered as such. But the end connectors, where everything screws and telescopes together, would be made out of brass. Here you can see with a little swipe of gold paint, I was able to simulate the end connectors. And for the swab itself, these are generally covered in a Feldgrau type canvas bag to protect the brush, and so I just went ahead and painted a field gray with Tamiya field gray swipe with a paintbrush. Same thing was also done on the opposite example with the exact same end results. As you can see, no matter if you're going with Panzer Gray, DAK, or even if you're going with a camo pattern, this little setup here is always an easy way to add a bit of extra color to the build. Along similar lines, the same thing can also be stated about the jack block. So the jack block in all these German tanks have metal straps for reinforcements, and the straps would be black on the real units, and so I just went here carefully with a paintbrush and painted them appropriately. This again is something that you want to pay attention to. Also, you want to pay attention to the shelf. A lot of people tend to just overpaint the thing to look like wood, or just paint it overspray with the model, neither of which are doing yourself any favors. And the last thing I do want to mention is with the fire extinguisher. Here we can see the fire extinguisher, and one trick that I like to do on basically all my German builds is I paint the fire extinguisher a different shade of color compared to the remainder of the vehicle. Me personally, I like to paint them to look like Panzer Gray, and on a DAK vehicle like this, the Panzer Gray fire extinguisher really pops out, and even on a standard Panzer Gray vehicle like this one over here, the fire extinguisher is painted in a darker shade of Panzer Gray, which again is something that would be seen on several real examples, and it's again a way to add a little extra color pop to the build. Of course, needless to say, on the front section over here, don't forget to paint your headlights. That's a given, but either way, it's a simple way. It's actually a simple technique that a lot of people tend to forget. It's amazing how many people tend to forget the stupid things like painting your taillights and painting your headlights. It's baffling. Do that, and the build will thank you for it. Moving topside again takes to one aspect on the kit where you do have some options, and that is with the engine grills. So this one over here is done with your standard early production version where it's completely grillless, and I always kind of dug the look of this one because of just how different it looks compared to the later incarnations of Panzer IVs that all had grills in these sections here. It's kind of interesting seeing everything as a standard flat plate. Then we have the DAK version with the DAK pattern of cutouts. This again is very different compared to the designs that came later on, but this one here definitely came first. The pieces are nicely rendered by Tamiya, where it is a two-piece assembly where we have the grills themselves, then we have these little shutters that get glued over in these locations. Everything is nicely molded and built very nicely. The pieces also drop directly into the two areas over here with absolutely no hand fitting being required. And it's, as you can see, stacked up side by side on how much different it makes the model look compared to one another. Moving up takes us to the turret, and as I mentioned before, the turret is actually the most complex and trickiest part on this entire model to put together for the reasons that I already mentioned. And one aspect on the turret that really you need to stay on the ball with is the seam removal, because this will make or break this build. If memory serves, I went ahead and pre-primed this area over here after the bodywork was concluded in order to make sure that the seam work was done. And in fact, I'm not sure if it was this one or the previous one or even the other one where I had to do that like maybe 2 or 3 times because there was a slight little indication that the seam was still there or that I didn't thoroughly remove the seam removal agent on the surface, be it putty or super glue. Either way, it took a few attempts on one of these examples in order to get it to look perfectly, and all that hard work definitely pays off, specifically if you leave it binless. If I bring the turret up to the camera, you will see that the piece is absolutely seamless, exactly what you're looking for. As for the DAK version, well, obviously you still want to take care of the seam, of course, you want to be thorough, but on this one here, you do have the ability of concealing it with the bustle bin. Bustle bin's really cool, it's really nicely engineered, it goes together really easily, it's a 2-piece assembly, and then just drops into the rear portion of the turret without any issues. Piece is nicely detailed with the hinges as well as also with all of the strap details that are present on the real one, and the kit itself rendered it actually pretty nicely. Carrying along takes to the turret sides. Nothing much to go over here. The hatches are stock, as are the hinge work. It is a multi-piece assembly, but it goes together very well. Take your time, and the piece should not give you any issues. Then we have the front section. This did require a little bit of fiddling, as I mentioned before, and also I had to re-etch the weld lines for the reasons that I mentioned. And now that everything is thoroughly painted and weathered, you can see what it looks like in its final format. Hopefully, with this lighting over here, the new etched welds are popping through, and you can see how it improves the model overall. On the barrel section, this too was a multi-piece assembly, and again, you want to take your time and assemble it in sub-assemblies where you do want to properly do the seam removal on the upper and lower sections before any of the other fittings get fitted in place, because obviously once they get mounted, you're not going to get access to these locations in an easy manner. So it's best done before everything gets finally installed. The other thing I do want to mention on the front section is a piece that's omitted on the Tamiya kit, and that is this little strap over here that holds the counterbalance frame in place. And this was something that always bugged me on these Panzer IVs. Exactly how is this thing fitted in place? It looks like it just hovers there, specifically if you follow the kit. Well, in actuality, there is this like hose clamp that's attached to the frame, and it bolts down, tightens down, and the thing is firmly set. And in order to fabricate this detailing, this was done with a little strip of thin aluminum. It was cut to shape, and then for the fastener section, I actually had a small little strip or segment of 3D print runner or sprue left over from one of the SS model kits that I've done in the past and also upcoming on the channel, hint hint. And those things, those little sprues are actually really great because they're really small in diameter and they come in handy for things like this. Once the little detailing was fabricated, it definitely helped the look of the model immensely. Same is also true for the other example that we have right here. Sometimes it's just little things like this is all you need to do to polish up an older model like the one you see presently. On the top portion of this one was the version that had the replacement handles that were fabricated out of wire. And as you can see, once everything is painted and weathered, they both blend in absolutely swimmingly. And that's all there is with the detailing. This takes us to the paint and the weathering. So for the base coat on both of these units, I actually rolled with Tamiya acrylics for both. Of course, beforehand, both models were painted with flat black spray paint to act as a primer, and then the acrylic was applied via the airbrush. For this one over here, I utilized Tamiya Panzer Gray, while on this one, I utilized one of the new DAK paints from Tamiya, and that DAK paint is awesome. We'll circle back to this in a moment. As for this one over here, I utilized the Tamiya Panzer Gray because it's a really nice color, but the difference was I wanted to make it look slightly different compared to the other one that was painted with the same paint, where this one here I went with a slightly different color for the the wash and the sun fading. The other one I went with, I believe, flat white, and this one I went with a cream color, so the two have a slightly different tint to them, which definitely looks great when you have the two side by side. DAK paint was utilized. I believe I used because to me it has like 2 or 3 versions. I used the 1942 version, which I really dig that color. It has this nice light tan pinkish hue to it. It's really hard to explain, but it looks great in its final format. The paint was applied via the airbrush, and then for weathering on this one here, I went with cream as a sun fading agent. I believe, yes, it's cream. I don't think it's white. I think it might be cream. And from there, I went ahead and added the remainder of the weathering, which is the same that I do on both. So the counter shading is all done via the airbrush with diluted Tamiya flat black, and then the chipping and the distressed edge effects are all done with the dry brushing. Of course, both models utilize extensively the Tamiya panel line accent material. The black is the one that I use, and it's awesome for getting into all the nooks and crannies. And on a Panzer IV over here, there are a bunch, specifically here on the front section, the engine deck, the turret. It's a fantastic wash. I love using that stuff. It's superb. So if you're building a model, I cannot recommend that stuff enough. Back to the DAK variant, this is actually unique for me because this is actually the very first DAK vehicle that I've ever done, which is funny to say because I built a lot of tanks in my time, and of all of them, specifically my German ones, I've never done a Africa Corps version. So this one here is quite literally the first one I've ever done out of the gate. And I gotta say, part of the reason why I've never done one before was I've seen several of the color shades on the market. Before, you would have to go to Model Master to get something either enamel or acrylic, and honestly the Model Master acrylics weren't that great. I always find them to be overly thin, but with Tamiya stepping up the plate and producing proper DAK colors now, it definitely streamlines the job and makes painting so much more easily done. And the colors look fantastic. Cannot stress enough how happy I am with this one, but more on that later. As for this variant over here, again, I just wanted to go with the traditional route with the standard Panzer Gray, and I rendered it in the following format. It came out excellent as well. For the markings, again, the kit supplies you with a bunch of different markings to outfit these vehicles. For the DAK one, they give you, I believe, one option for a DAK, and that's the variant that you see right here. And for this one here, I went with a very early version. I believe this is the one that would be for Poland, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head. And that's because it has the standard white cross without the black stroke, or the opposite, or the other way around, I should say. The black cross with the white strokes. So this one here is a very early war variant. Again, I believe Poland, if I'm not mistaken. One thing I do want to mention about the markings is that they go on pretty well and effortlessly. The marking quality is superb. Again, Tamiya always had some pretty good markings. And on this pattern here, though, the Panzer IV ausf.D kit, you want to be careful with this side. Because you have this large channel in the way over here, trying to fit the cross on is very, very problematic. I found the best way to do it is to literally cut the marking in several locations in order to piecemeal it in the appropriate location. The top little section's right over here, and then you amputate the middle section, which would be behind this little bracket, and then you have the bottom portion that on this one here is actually covered up by the shovel. On this version, the same thing also applies. So this, with the way the piece gets fit in place, this 813 mark fits in this nice little location. That was advantageous. But the cross, again, you do have to amputate the middle section of the black area in order to get the cross to properly fit. And this wasn't just true for these two examples, but also if you render it with the other version, the one that's on the box art, you will still have the same problem with the cross. So no matter which version of the ausf.D kit that you are rendering, you are going to have to do a little snippy snip with the cross in order to get it to properly fit in place. But something that's really easily done. But it is something that a lot of people may not factor in. The other thing to mention is with the turret markings. With the way the Panzer IV is, we have this visor in this section, and trying to get the marking over the visor is a bit tricky. It's still something that can be done, but it's best done by applying some strategic swipes with a X-Acto, because when you're making the cuts, the piece can actually lie flat onto the model on the surface of the target, also conform to the shape of the visor in a much more efficient way as trying to shoehorn the thing as one piece. That's another tip that, I should say, another factor to factor in on one of these Panzer IV AusfDs. But not just the D, many Panzer IVs have a similar type situation. But it's definitely one I encountered on the D. This one here, you're spared. There are no turret markings, so you're basically good to go in that regard. As for securing the markings in place, again, both models are thoroughly sealed with VMS matte varnish. As I often say in these videos, people probably think I'm on the payroll for them, but that's just not the case. I just love their stuff. It is a superb product, goes on without any sort of problems, from the bottle straight into the airbrush, right onto the model, let it dry, and you are set. The markings, as you can see, are thoroughly flattened to the vehicle. There's no silvering or anything along those lines. This is partially due with the high quality of the stock decals, and also with just how they work well with the VMS matte varnish like a fish to water. This one here came out absolutely superb. And the DAK one here is also no exception. Markings came out absolutely swimmingly. Same is also true for the opposite side as well. And because I've mentioned it several times in this video, I, of course, would be foolish not to go ahead and give a quick cameo to the other Panzer IV AusfD that I built previously. So, with the other version on the table, you get to see all three now, clear as day. And even though both of these are Panzer Gray and I believe are painted with the same paints, you can see just with the slightly different shade of washes and filters, you can have the two models look very different from one another, even though they are essentially the same color. And doing stuff like that is a great way to add a little bit of extra differentiation and a little bit of spice to your collection, and it's something that can be done to avoid being myopic. And that's something that can actually happen to the best of us. You can easily get into a rut where all your builds start looking the same, and that's something that's not really beneficial. So it's always good to shift it up a little bit, even if it means just changing one little element on the build. It will, in the end, lead for something that can look a bit different, which is a way to add spice and variety to your collection. Also, going back to what I mentioned before about the idler, this one here is the static rear idler wheel, and this one here is the functional rear idler wheel. So let me move this guy out of the way. As you can see, the only real difference is the size of the hubcap. And as I referenced before, this one here would be the quote-unquote inaccurate version. This one here would be the more to scale variant. But this one here has the ability to roll. This one doesn't. As for which one you want to pick for your build, that again boils down to personal preference and what you're going to do with the vehicle. If you're going to go ahead and build it either motorized, or you want to push the thing, build it with some playability in mind, this one here would probably be the best way to go, even though I don't recommend building these things to play with, but if you are, that's the best way to go. This one here is if you just want to leave it as standard static shelf display. And at the end of the day, there's nothing much more I could have wanted or anticipated out of these two builds here. From start to finish, they went together without any sort of real problems, and this is a hallmark found on old school Tamiya kits, and these two, of course, are no exception. And this is a perfect point to pivot into skill level and recommendations. And I'm going to go a little bit light on this area over here because I frankly already went into this information in far more depth in the previous video. And all that information obviously is just as relevant for these two as it was for the previous build. To jump right into it though, this kit here is one that I actually personally enjoy. I actually do love this kit. It's a very fun one to put together. It's representing a very interesting version of the Panzer IV family, and on top of that, these kits are very, very prolific and are also very affordable. And all these attributes are great, however, this does come with an asterisk. I'm pretty sure you're going to be seeing it typed into great extent in the comment section below, but this kit's weakest point is with its accuracy. The Tamiya Panzer IV AusfD, as awesome as a kit that I enjoy being, does have lots of Achilles heels to it. This is not an accurate representation of the Panzer IV ausf.D, and Tamiya made a lot of shortcuts when they were designing this kit back in the 70s. As for what these errors are, I'm not going to go into that in this video, but this information is greatly talked about on the various online chat rooms and forums that are out there, as well as I'm pretty sure someone in the comment section is going to put that information in a bit more depth. But either way, in a nutshell, if you are looking for a very accurate rendition of the Panzer IV ausf.D, the old school Tamiya kit is not going to be the kit for you. Fortunately, if you are looking for something with that level of detail fidelity, there are lots of more modern release tooling kits that are on the market, and those will definitely fit the bill better compared to this old one here. However, as I frequently mention, this comes at the expense of complexity, and if you do not have the skill sets to tackle one of those more advanced kits, you're not exactly going to have a pleasant experience. And that is where this kit comes into play. The one aspect of this kit that keeps it relevant today, as much as it was when it was first released, is its simplicity. If you're looking for a Panzer IV ausf.D, but you don't have the skill sets for some of those more advanced tooling kits, this is the kit that I would recommend starting with. From here, you get a good basic idea, you get to hone in those skills, and then from here, you could springboard off one of those or to one of those more advanced super tooling kits, and this is something that can assist you with that type of a build. By the time you're done with this one, perhaps you might have some new skill sets so that you can better tackle the other build without there being any surprises or being put too much far out of your reach. The other thing that, or I should say the other person that I would also recommend this kit to, is anyone who's looking for a Panzer IV ausf.D, but you're not really a rivet counting perfectionist, and you're just looking for something that more or less fits the bill. If that's you, the Tamiya kit here is recommended all day long. Of course, being a 1/35 scale kit from Tamiya, these kits are very collectible in their own right, and with these kits being in production for as long as they have, picking one up and adding it to your collection is relatively easily done and also affordably done. As I mentioned before, these kits can be built by just about anybody from a beginner to a intermediate and of course an advanced. However, generally the people who are an advanced skill set already built one of these kits in the past or are going to find this kit's simplistic detailing to be a bit on the boring end, and generally those people are looking for something that has better detail fidelity, which again they would tend to steer more towards the advanced kits. But having said that, yes, you could build one of these kits and have a good time building it like I did here. Also, being a 1/35 scale Panzer IV, there are a plethora of aftermarket accessories out there, from replacement tracks, replacement wheels, photo etch, 3D print, turned aluminum, what have you. If that's going to be a value to add to modify one of these kits here, that's again best left up to discretion of the builder. Me personally, I think it's best just to roll with it in the out-of-the-box format, with the exception of the small little tweaks that I mentioned in this video. But of course, your mileage may vary. One other aspect that I personally enjoy about this kit is that with one kit you can build it in a multitude of configurations from just with the out-of-the-box components. This would include the different detail accessories that I touched upon in this video, as well as also the different types of markings. With that in mind, you can build this thing in at least 4 different variants, which is great because if you want to basically bracket the build, so to speak, you can have an example built of every one of the marking and detail options that are kit supplied. And with these models being simple and affordable, this does make it a viable option to go ahead and flesh out your collection to a great extent. And with that, that wraps up this double feature model showcase video for the two 1/35 scale German Panzer IV ausf.D medium tanks. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/35 scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of these two builds, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.